Good afternoon, everyone, and I can't tell you what an absolute pleasure it is to be back in St. Michael's Theatre. We had no summer school in 2020 for obvious reasons of the pandemic, so it's really, really brilliant to be back here to get this summer school back up and running and maybe to see a little bit of normalcy creep back in. I want to welcome the audience who are here with us today, and I should have asked everybody to turn off their phones, including myself. Sorry about that. That's my mother. She's probably ringing to wish me luck. So just to welcome our audience who are here in restricted numbers with us in St. Michael's, but also to welcome our audience, a new departure for the Kennedy Summer School and how we've adapted to the times, our audience who are streaming in. We're delighted to host this particular session, this particular event on the Shared Island Initiative with the Department of Taoiseach. And I do want to thank Lisa D. Collery and Owen Duffy from the Department of Taoiseach, who have been absolutely a great help and assistance to us in putting together the panel. I want to thank our panellists for being with us as well. I want to thank Bryan Dobson, who is going to chair this event, and thank Bryan for voluntarily coming down to take on this event and host it for us and support the summer school and to support the wider community in New Ross. So without further ado from me, I'll hand you over to Bryan Dobson and our panel. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Bryan. Thank you, Bryan, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to what is the first of the panel discussions of this year's Kennedy Summer School. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in person with our panellists, at least 4 of the 5 of them. And we'll be introducing our remote contributor in just a moment. It's fantastic to be here, to be able to have a face-to-face discussion at a suitable distance, of course, and also to have an audience, to have you here with us in the theatre, as well, of course, as those of you who are joining us remotely and will be able to listen in to this conversation and this discussion. Let me introduce our panel for you this afternoon. On my extreme left, Darragh O'Brien, TD, Minister for Housing, Local Government and Heritage. He's had a busy week, of course, but we're going to ask him to switch his focus from housing, a pressing issue, obviously, to our theme today, which is the shared island experience, and more about that in just a moment. Sitting beside Darragh, we have Sarah Creighton, who is a writer, a lawyer, and a commentator. She's based in Belfast and is currently working with a housing charity in Northern Ireland. On my right, I'm delighted to welcome Sorcha Eastwood, who's an Alliance Party councillor from the Lagan Valley area, which is the city of Lisburn. That's her home place, and she's very welcome. A return visitor, I believe, to the school here in New Ross, Sorcha. And finally, here on stage on my further right, we have Alison Morris, crime correspondent with the Belfast Telegraph and one of the most respected commentators on very many issues in Northern Ireland today. And we were joined remotely by Dr. Robert Mauro, Executive Director of the Irish Institute and Global Leadership Institute at Boston College. And there is Robert. Bob, you're very welcome this afternoon. It's wonderful to be able to welcome you here to St. Michael's Theatre and for you to be able to take part in our discussion. We all know, very involved on a very active way with the summer school, and great that you can take part. So we'll just check that you can hear us and we can hear you. You might say a few words.
Hi, Bryan. It's great to see everyone, and I'm really pleased that people were able to gather in New Ross this year.
Right, well, we're delighted that you can join us. Before we come to the theme of our discussion this afternoon, I know very many of us were so sad this morning to hear of the death of Pat Hume, who would have been known, I think, to everybody, certainly on this stage. She was an extraordinary figure in the civic and political life of Northern Ireland over a very, very long time. I know, Alison, you were covering John Hume's funeral, just about a year ago, and at that was an occasion in which her vital role in supporting politically as well as every other way John over very many years was highlighted.
And you could see, although it wasn't the funeral he would have had in normal times because of COVID, the affection for which the people from the city of Derry hold, not just John, but Pat as well. You know, they were, the first couple of Derry. At that funeral itself, the priest had said that anyone writing the history of Ireland and Ireland's peace process, if they left Pat out, it would be an incomplete history, and I think that's true. You know, people loved her, and remember, she was a very feisty political operator in her own right. You know, she wasn't just the wife of John Hume, she was, the the engine behind that couple and stayed with them during those very tough times in the peace process when he came under a lot of flack for the Humes Adams talks, and she was by his side that whole time.
Yeah, and I suppose her experience, Sorcha, really underlies the price that very many families of people involved in politics, not just in Northern Ireland, but particularly in this context in Northern Ireland, because of the very unusual pressures that people involved in politics have to face.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I think that Pat, in her own right, was very much a political operator, almost behind the scenes, having to pull that double duty that people talk about, where she had her own home life that she had to manage, all that kind of emotional work that we talk about that must have been absolutely phenomenal, the weight of carrying that, as well as raising a family at the same time, as well as being almost a confidant and advisor to John Hume, who is an absolute giant of this island. So a truly remarkable woman that will be very much missed.
And Sarah, also somebody who was respected really right across the political spectrum, wasn't she?
She really was, and you could see that yesterday when it was announced. All the political leaders, unionists, were all coming out and praising her and saying how lovely she was and how warm she was, and she was really able to connect with so many people. I think she was an incredible woman.
Yeah, and behind closed doors, though, politically, Darragh, she was well able to hold her ground politically. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I had the pleasure of meeting her a couple of times, and actually our Taoiseach, Mauro Martin, would keep in touch with Pat on a regular basis right through the years, phone calls and letters. And last time I met her actually was at Martin McGuinness's funeral in Derry, and John at the time was obviously battling his illness, but she's just such a grace about her, very humble, but so determined. But you could actually see probably who the real boss was in one respect, that everyone, when even that day, which was that Pat was there, everyone knew who she was, but and she was so organized. But I think, as Sorcha said, it's 100% right, is that when the history is written, Pat Hume has a major role within that in her own right, but also as a great couple that they were, John Hume and Pat, with their steely determination and their commitment to peace.
Yeah, and Bob, I mean, we know the role that John Hume played in terms of involving key figures in American politics in searching for a political solution here, and that was something that Pat very much supported and backed up.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's still very well remembered here in the city of Boston. Many people from the Kennedy family to the O'Neill family continue to have great connections with Derry and the Hume family, and huge amounts of respect for the leadership that Pat and John showed in the peace process, and that will be remembered and is continued to be remembered by many.
All right, well, we remember her today, and our thoughts are very much with and our sympathies with her family on this very sad day, and thank you for those reflections. And so to the topic of our discussion this afternoon, the shared island experience. This is prompted by the creation towards the end of last year of the Shared Island Unit within the Department of the Taoiseach. It's described as a unit that's to act and drive coordination across the whole of government, a whole of government initiative, and to build consensus to state its aims around our shared future on the island, recognising that neither constitutional future provided for under the Good Friday Agreement is preordained. The future is ours to decide, ours to determine, but in a way that is shared and in a way that we move forward with consensus and agreement, which I suppose is what underpins the peace agreement that was signed in 1998. So perhaps maybe just to set the scene, I might ask the Minister just to give us an outline of what your understanding is, and you're not directly involved, as I understand it, in North-South issues. I mean, well, some of them you would be, yes. Yeah. But just to focus on the fact that this is an initiative which is meant to draw in ministers from across the government, a whole of government approach. Now, talk to us about that aspect of this.
Yeah, look, I suppose we were very conscious in putting the programme for government together that, we look at the potential of our island, but our relationship also east-west between the two islands here, particularly post-Brexit, when we're very close with Britain around the EU table when Britain was, and the North were in the European Union. And I think there was a strong feeling, and certainly driven by the Taoiseach, because this is, to be frank, it is his initiative, and it was very much Mauro Martin's initiative and continues to be, that we seek a way together as all the people who share this island, but also the political institutions, to try to maximise the potential that we have. Look at the areas, like if I take in my own brief local government, for argument's sake, there's a lot of cooperation between the north and south at a local authority level, as to what happens there. But then you get into the tangible things, the real projects. And I think what Micheál wanted was looking at tangible initiatives that are going to actually improve things like the Ulster Canal, like the Narrow Water Bridge, all of these real initiatives that affect positively people on the ground. But not only that, to give us an opportunity to meet more often. And even in this strange COVID world that we've been in, we've had a number of North-South ministerial councils virtually. We've had a number of them, 2 physically as well, where people have, or 3, where people have attended. But the agenda is actually very focused now. And I speak as someone who didn't have experience prior to this, but I think what has been important since the executive was reformed and the executive was up and running as well, is that we make sure that consistent contact on the things that affect our lives as citizens on the island, and indeed with our nearest neighbours in the island of Britain, that how we can work together. And there is vast potential. And what I've really found is that areas even like on biodiversity, on agriculture, on like our train service across the island, practical things where we're sharing experience. And I know we might talk later a little bit on housing, but I've been actually, if I could say, really pleasantly surprised as to how engaged it is, and engaged all representatives have been, regardless of political parties.
Are you saying this is an initiative which is entirely without any agenda? It's just to look at practical areas of cooperation. It's not designed ultimately to promote unity, to further that political objective.
No, there's no ulterior motive behind it, nor should there be. It's about how we can live on the island better together. And should that evolve evolve with improving relations between the communities, both within the north and between north-south, and indeed the east-west relationship. But I mentioned Brexit as well, which I think this is important, because it's done now, and Britain has left the European Union. We accept that, and we've always said we respected that vote. But a sizable portion of obviously of the population in the north voted to remain. We still want to make sure that we keep links, proper, tangible links at political level, and that we deepen our relationship, frankly. Like the relationship between North-South and indeed between Dublin and London is a really important one. Right. Most of our families have people, all over both islands. We trade so much with each other, we share so much, we have so much shared experience. And all that shared experience feeds into Shared Island, and then looks at what our shared potential is leading into the future, because there's vast potential.
Sarah, how do you look at this this specific initiative, but initiatives that are trying to move in this direction? What do you make of it?
I think they're very good. I think they're necessary. And we're talking about this doesn't have a political agenda. It's doesn't have an ulterior motive. Obviously, I'm a unionist and from a Protestant background. Unionists are very wary of engaging in conversations about a united Ireland because they don't want one. To talk about the relationship between North and South, that's important, because no matter what happens with Northern Ireland, whether it remains in the Union, whether it leaves the Union, that relationship is still going to be there. That relationship still has to be worked on. The problems that are in Northern Ireland are not going to go away. So I think it's really important to have an initiative that does talk about sharing on this island. Though obviously at the moment there are some issues, obviously, with the protocol and things like that. There's a lot of anger in Northern Ireland about that, particularly from the Unionist community and the Loyalist community. Though it is nuanced, I think. But I do think that's why the initiatives like this are important. But I do think it has to go all year round, not just at...
Right.
Yeah.
Does it give rise, though, to some suspicion?
I think it does, yes. Unionists we're complicated people, I think we're slightly misunderstood. But I think, there are some bad faith actors out there who I think do have an ulterior motive, and then there are people that are very genuine, and I think some unionists are just very wary. They're like, is there something else going on? Is there not? So I think it's just about trying to show them that it's not, that it is actually about a genuine building relationships.
And how do you do that? Well, maybe from where does that wariness or suspicion spring?
From a number of places, I think. I think unionists always have the sense that they're always going to be betrayed and let down, and a lot of the time they are right. They're betrayed by their own side, by Britain, by Westminster, being let them down very famously in recent years. And I just think there's just that suspicion that they're being used, that they're being pulled into something that they don't want. Really, I think they're still behind the walls, to use that analogy, I think.
yeah.
And I think sometimes they need to come out from behind the walls. I think they need to make a big effort in that.
And just what would you say to Darragh O'Brien about how the government here could deal with those people within the unionist community who do have suspicions? How do you allay those?
I would
How
say
should he allay those?
you need to engage with people all year round, not just within panels and forums like this. You have to listen to people on other multiple different issues. It's not just about North and South, but also about issues within Northern Ireland. You have to listen to people. You know, it's not about getting people onto the panels, you know, and things like that. It has to be, you have to show people that you care about them all the time, not just for events like this. I'm just using that as an analogy. You know, I think just that connection with people that is all that needs to be there. I think that would convince people that you're genuine. I think.
Well, we'll come back to both raised issues, which we'll come back to. But Sorcha, if I can bring you in as someone whose politics, I'm sure you would argue, represents and seeks to expand and support the middle ground in Northern Ireland politics. What role do you see for those closer, practical north-south links in doing that?
Well, I think in terms of this piece with the shared island unit, what I kind of regard in my mind as a jumping off point almost for this is the whole fundamental dynamic of the relationship changing because of Brexit. And I think there was very much a need and a want by people not to have that changed beyond recognition. If you go back to the original mapping exercise that was conducted, there were like well over 100 areas of cooperation north-south that Northern Ireland and the South worked on, and that can't change. You know, we're talking about the likes of those projects that you mentioned, infrastructure. I can hear my colleagues west of the Ban absolutely shouting, yes, can we have some trains? You know, so it's things like that mean everyday things to people. I'm thinking also of the North-South corridor. My council, Lisburn Castlereagh, is included in one of those council groups that are very much part of that North-South project, trying to capitalise on the A1 traffic going down to Dublin and traffic going from Dublin to Belfast. And those are the practical things. They may not end up in a juicy political row, but they make sure that people have jobs, that they have money to raise their family. And it also means that we don't lose that fundamental relationship. Where I think a lot of people in Northern Ireland, obviously the vast majority voted to remain, but you know, I think people are now at a different stage. I don't want to use the word mature because I think that's too condescending, but you know, people have moved on. They really have. And the Northern Ireland today isn't the Northern Ireland that maybe people grew up with or knew or are most familiar with. And I think it's the same issues here that people at home want to talk about in terms of housing, health, education, jobs. And I think the fundamental underpinning of how I see this working is that it's always good to talk. As Sarah says, it's important to talk all the time to keep that dialogue going so that whenever you do maybe hit a bump in the road, because we're going to have plenty of bumps in the road, believe you me, you know, whenever you hit those, that you have that relationship where you understand that person. You know, you were asking Sarah, you know, where does that come from and what's that emotion and what does that feel like? And, you know, that's really good because it shows that you're saying, look, I don't fully maybe always understand where you've come from, but let's do this together, let's work together.
Is the political landscape, and I mean with a small p, I mean right across party politics, but the civic environment as well, is that shifting? Is it changing? Is it reshaping in Northern Ireland? Is it?
I think it is. I think we're seeing a continuation of a fundamental realigning of politics in Northern Ireland since about 2016. So the scheduled Assembly election, this is where I get my big election nerd hat on. Right. So the scheduled Assembly election in May 2016 was kind of almost run-of-the-mill in a way, you would say. And then the snap Assembly election of 2017 changed everything in a way. A lot of people who had previously felt very comfortable didn't feel comfortable anymore after that. And then obviously we had that painful, arduous process where you were stood outside buildings, we were inside buildings, blowing hot air, and we were trying to get the show back on the road again. And I think ultimately where people are now is finding their feet. Don't forget, you've had a lot of change in leadership from some of the main parties. You've also had people who have tried to undertake various different projects of work within their parties. And I think the public haven't fully made their mind up yet as to where they're going. I think people like my party, which is unaligned, which represents people from right across the spectrum, I think we're making headroads that people wouldn't necessarily have fully believed. It's the same with the Green Party, same with People Before Profit, same with others who wouldn't see themselves as aligned. And I think that's really important, but it's certainly not something that we're taking for granted. I don't think you can certainly sit and go, oh, well, there's a whole bunch of people out there who don't really feel represented. Everybody's got to work hard for the vote, and everybody's got to listen.
So, Alison, I want to ask you maybe about that. Are the tectonic plates beginning to shift a little bit? But maybe just, first of all, to bring it back to the initiative that we've heard about from Darragh, we've been discussing it. I mean, you're reporting to a Northern Ireland readership every day. Are these issues that to any extent concern or preoccupy people? Are they saying, actually, we need more of this? Because obviously they're concerned about things like health and education, all the things that concern any electorate, whether there's good government. What about some of the things that are envisaged by this particular initiative?
I think I'm going to be the big Debbie Downer here because everyone was all so positive. I have been involved in some of those Shared Island conversations, albeit privately, in terms of where they're going with that. And you can see the benefits in terms of health and police on the border, housing infrastructure, all of that. But then we had Brexit and we have the current unrest within the protocol. As a security journalist, I speak to people who would probably be considered the extremes on both sides quite regularly. The Orange Order had initially agreed to engage with the unit, and then, as I reported earlier this year, they had withdrawn that. And the problem dates back to, I think, that the misconception about how Brexit was negotiated and how we ended up with the protocol. So loyalists believe that the threat of dissident Republican violence, if there was border infrastructure, led to the protocol. That is clearly not the case. Dissident Republicanism, violent dissident Republicanism, is in complete disarray. We're talking about a few handfuls of people here and there in pockets. They are of no major threat to national security. It was Irish America, and it was the pressure from America that ensured that putting any infrastructure at the border was a no-go. When we had senior US figures saying, if there is any border infrastructure, if there is any damage to the Good Friday Agreement, there will be no US trade deal. That is what motivated Boris Johnson, who is a man motivated by money, let's face it, and not by preserving the Union or looking after the unionist population of Northern Ireland. But somewhere along the line, that got sort of interpreted into this was a threat of violence that won through. And that's how we have seen those sort of protests on the streets of Belfast earlier this year, when some people believe, well, if we threaten violence, then we'll get what we want, because they threaten violence and they got what they want.
Has that penetrated, deep into and broadly into the unionist community, or is it still really in sections that are more maybe aligned with loyalist paramilitarism?
It's the working class loyalist communities, and they're the people who are terrified, and they are terrified by initiatives like this because it's all about perception. So, look, we're on a trajectory, and we know that we're on a trajectory. This is the centenary year of Northern Ireland, but demographics have changed, voting patterns have changed, the unionist vote is scattered to the wind. There is, according to recent opinion polls, no dominant unionist party anymore. There is no big one. There's the DUP are going to, at the next election, more than likely appear either slightly ahead or quite even with the other two unionist parties. And at the same time, nationalism is just staying static, although the demographics are changing. We know there's a much younger population among nationalists, and so as time goes on, that demographic will change. I think that unionists think that we're marching them on a road to United Ireland, and they're resisting that at every possible opportunity. And we see that with some of the very bad faith politics that Sorcha spoke about. And what's happened in the past is those unionist parties have tried to use fear to get those working class voters out to vote, instead of actually giving them practical things that can help make their community better. When I go into a community like the Shankill, they honestly believe that at the other side of that big massive peace wall, there is some sort of prosperous utopia where everyone is living these wonderful lives when they're exactly in the same economic situation. But that has been portrayed as if nationalists benefited from peace and loyalists and unionists didn't. And I think that's very dangerous.
I mean, are you saying that in your judgment, meaningful progress on North-South cooperation really is on hold until Brexit, the protocol, that's all dealt with. And that's a big political as well as an economic and a diplomatic hurdle to cross.
And people like the DUP who were quite happy to engage in those north-south structures in the ministerial meetings are now terrified because they think they're losing votes to the extreme, to the TUV, and they don't want to be seen to be cozying up alongside the Irish government. I'll give you an example. When we had the deal that got the Stormont structures back up and running again, at that stage we had, Julian Smith, who was the then Secretary of State, and Simon Coveney standing side by side to deliver this new decade, new approach deal. They held a press conference outside Stormont, and unionists went doolally because it looked like it was a joint agreement. They were like, why is that man standing there? What has it got to do with him? 2 days later, we had Leo Varadkar showed up along with Boris Johnson. They give separate press conferences because Boris Johnson did not even want to be seen standing beside Leo Varadkar in the halls of Stormont because he didn't want it to look like this was an all-island joint government deal. So there's that perception and that fear. Now, we know these things all go on behind the scenes, but will they engage publicly and allow their voters to know they're engaging? But I do think that what needs to be done is the need to reach out and show unions this is not a threat to their sovereignty. We know the Good Friday Agreement has the provisions for a border poll, and when they are met, that is when that border poll will happen. But if they think, I think that there's a fear that anything that involves cross-border cooperation is just an attempt to try and put us into a sort of all-island structure. We had a very mundane police report released this week that caused absolute mayhem among unionists who were, loyalists who were phoning talk shows and saying that, on Garda Síochána we're going to be patrolling the streets of Newry. I mean, people just lost their minds over it. That even the simplest thing can be misinterpreted.
Let me bring Bob in here because I want to ask you about what your assessment is of American engagement, particularly the White House engagement with the Irish issue under the Biden presidency moment. But first of all, just Alison's point there about the pressure brought to bear on the United Kingdom, on the British government from the United States over the border as a result of the Brexit vote. Did it have the impact that she identifies there, do you think?
Well, we firstly apologize for some noise in the background here. I hope it doesn't interrupt our conversation. To answer the question, it's I think a difficult thing to assess. I don't know. Obviously, we saw American political leaders, especially most vocally, Richie Neal, engaging on this issue, along with the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and linking it to the trade deal. That said, a trade deal is going to be difficult to develop between the UK and the United States regardless. So I'm not really sure the two are necessarily linked. They may well be. I would take, I think, some real insider knowledge about what is happening inside Number 10 on this in order to assess that. So I would suspect that the United States and the Biden administration and the Trump administration did make it clear that they did not want Brexit to interfere with the Good Friday Agreement. Now, what exactly that meant, it has been different between the two administrations. The Trump administration was a little less clear about what that might mean for physical infrastructure on the border, for instance. And I know later today, in fact, this might be an issue that Mick Mulvaney could address. He has addressed it in the past.
Well,
the Biden administration has been more clear about that position, but honestly, I'm not really sure if the Irish America and the Biden administration had much to do with those particular outcomes, given how complicated the larger geostrategic issues are and issues around trade generally are.
All right. Well, I mean, that brings me to the broader issue. American involvement, engagement with Ireland has ebbed and flowed, has been very crucial, we all know, at certain stages over the last 20, 40 years, over quite a long period now. What's your assessment of the what we might expect from the Biden presidency? I mean, he's a long list of very pressing domestic and other foreign issues. Is he going to be paying much attention to Ireland, do you think, Bob?
Well, I think that the president holds Ireland near and dear to his heart. There are many people in his administration in leadership positions who also have this very similar feeling. And as we already know, that there are people in other branches of government, in Congress in particular, who have an interest in this. I mean, that said, there is a massive slate of issues to engage for the Biden administration, not only internationally, but domestically. I do think the Biden administration will keep an eye on what is happening in Ireland. I do think that they will seek to engage positively and look to help. But it is an issue. Ireland and Northern Ireland are topic areas that maybe might not be at the top of the agenda on a weekly basis. To just simply too much going on. I mean, that said, more than 4 years ago now, Biden visited Ireland on presumably his last trip as a political leader. He was vice president at the time, and it was clear, from the engagements that he had then, that he had a deep interest and love, for the island. So I do think that this will continue to be something that they address. It's just in the totality of all the things that they'll be working on. It is only one aspect of it.
Yeah, and just a quick word on this, Minister Darragh, Bryan. Engaging with the United States, Washington, using whatever influence. I hesitate to use the word influence, but using whatever means are at our disposal. That's something the government would hope to maintain, those connections and that contribution.
We do, and I think it's important. Something that Sarah mentioned earlier, though, it's not just at set-piece events. This is more enduring. And I think, to be fair, in the States and under the Biden administration in particular, there's a more mature understanding of Ireland and the nuances within Ireland than if you go back 30, 40 years of what maybe a green-tinted view of Ireland politically in that sense. And I know Richie Neal and Brendan Boyle, and we would have met them. I would have been in the States with them, and the caucus, the Irish caucus there is very strong, but it links north and south with different traditions too. Mm-hmm. And actually you have but there is an interest certainly in Congress and in the Senate, and there was an interest post-Brexit to ensure that anything that may have caused any type of difficulty to Good Friday would not allow it to be happen. And I wouldn't really understate the impact that the perception of the incoming president, as he was, President Biden, and his view with regard to Ireland and the European Union. If you think that the former President Trump, and I say this respectfully, didn't have that same view of particularly the European Union and would have been very clearly on the side of one part of it. So I think the President Biden now, and I remember the last time he was here as Vice President 4 years ago, and then he's been here since then. So he does before he was elected president, so he does have an affinity here. But
so what do you say to Sarah's point that, the effort, the diplomatic drive that was successfully put in to keep the border open has had, as a consequence, the raising of so many fears in the unionist community?
Back to that, remember those negotiations took place during the Trump admission, and his relationship would have been much better with Westminster and with Boris Johnson. I do think that Boris Johnson hoped that he would be negotiating that trade deal with the Trump administration and not with the Biden administration.
But what about the point that Sarah makes, that actually the result of this is to set back the agenda of moving forward in a practical way with North-South cooperations because it has deepened unionist suspicions?
No, I hope that's not the case, and I know that there are issues, and there's no question, particularly, and it's been enunciated publicly with regard to the perception of the protocols and the difficulties that may cause, particularly, in certain parts of the north. But we want to work through that. The Taoiseach has said that, very, very openly. But
you accept it's been a setback?
Well, no, I think. Well, you see, you got to remember it was an agreement that was made between the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the European Union. Okay, so that was signed up to by the British government at the time. So without going back on that, it's now about how one implements that, and by ensuring we do that we're not affecting in any negative way the really good relations that are there amongst the people.
Right.
And I think decent relations, if I could say, and very good at some levels, but decent at others.
Do you accept that the protocol, whatever the good reasons for it and however it came about, has been a setback to North-South relations?
No, I actually don't, Brian. I want to be clear on that. I don't believe it's been a setback to North-South relations. I think what it has been is it has caused a complication. We've had many bumps in the road over this time. I think it's well within our competence to actually be able to deal with it. I think, to be fair, the way that Taoiseach has dealt with this issue as well, particularly around shared island, and I take the points made earlier on that we have been abundantly clear that this is about us as peoples actually trying to improve the lot for all of us across all the different areas, from heritage to biodiversity to transport, housing, and all those various things. post a big change in the European Union, like Britain leaving, which was kind of, a shock to the system, there's always going to be, when you're trying to work through an exit agreement, some issues that will take time to work out. And I think we will work that out.
Sarah, do you want to come in this?
Yeah, it has damaged relations north and south. Like, I'm a protocol pragmatist. I just think, look, we just need to get on with it and make it work. That's my view on things. But the problem is that the Good Friday Agreement does not mention border infrastructure north and south. It does not mention borders down the Irish Sea. It does not deal with Brexit at all. And when the protocol came in, it protected north-south relations, but that came at the expense of east-west. And obviously I understand that that's why the Republic did that. It was to protect your interests and the EU's interests, but it has come at the expense of the relationship with Britain. Obviously, we're still in the Union. It hasn't affected Northern Ireland's constitutional status, but I think the recent court ruling makes clear that it has affected the dynamic between Northern Ireland and Britain, which is important to people. And, I think we're already in an economic united Ireland. It's capitalism, beige or grey, take your pick. I'm not, to be blunt about it, but when the protocol was implemented, and it was said that this was to protect the Good Friday Agreement, many unionists and loyalists thought, well, we signed up to this agreement, and we hate this, and we're told that it's to protect this agreement, but we're being completely ignored. So to go back to Biden, I don't think Joe Biden has much of a connection. Well, but from my perception, I don't think he speaks for the unionists or loyalists in Northern Ireland, and many were very insulted by him when he pushed for the protocol to be implemented, when they were very angry about it. He endorsed a letter written by a number of congressmen. One of those congressmen was Peter King, who was very supportive of the provisional IRA. Not a very nice man, in my opinion. So I think a lot of work needs to be done. But as I said, I do think I'm a protocol pragmatist. I'm glad that the Ulster Unionists seem to be moving in that direction. I think we just have to deal with it. Whatever the solution is, you can't implement a hard border between north and south. The best option, I think, is for the whole UK to align much more closely with the EU.
Right. And just before I move on, because I do want to look at other issues here, but just, Sorcha, maybe on the protocol and all of that, is that polarising, both the public and politics in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt that, it's really interesting. You talked about this is meant to be about peoples. And backstage before this panel started, we were all talking about health, and we were all talking about stories about how our family members or people have been impacted by health. And I'm absolutely obsessed with knocking doors, talking to people, constantly canvassing, and that's just what you've got to do. And to be honest, there was a little flurry of activity at the start of the year, not from what I would regard Joe Public, but from businesses. And of course, certainly that needed dealt with, certainly that needed addressed. But see now, in terms of what the people's, if we're doing this in honour to acknowledge what people want us to work on, I have not received anything at all from Joe Public on the protocol, but I have received, actually, my parent can't get the treatment they need, my kid can't get a statement of special educational needs, or I'd really like that narrow water bridge to be hurried up because it would be good for my business, or whatever. I'm not going to be somebody that's going to be in denial about it and say that it has an impact on things. Of course it has, but as Alison has also said, there was a policing report this week. If there's not a policing report, then there'll be something else, and then the week after that there'll be something else. And I think the challenge for the politicians in the room is to go, look, as I said at the start, and as you've said yourself, there will be bumps in the road, and there will be many of them. But the challenge to us is to say, look, what do we all have in common? What do we want to work to here? And, as you said, Sarah, when the time comes, and people can talk to that issue specifically at that time then. But until then, people have issues that need dealt with in the here and now.
I want to move on to one particular aspect of the Shared Island Initiative, and it's under this Shared Island Dialogue, as it's described. And it sets as an objective to hear underrepresented voices in this debate, and it identifies young people, new communities, and women. And I'd like to just give a little bit of time to considering that, the extent to which those voices are heard, they're being listened to, they're being ignored, they're interested in engaging. Sarah, are young people in Northern Ireland engaged by politics?
Yes and no. Just because, I move in a lot of political spaces, and they're dominated by a lot of young people who just love politics and are very enthused by it. But equally, there's a lot of people in my life whose attitude is really just, can you shut up, please, and leave me alone, and don't ever talk to me about this. And they're just so depressed by it and frustrated with it. A lot of them don't vote, some of them, or they rock up and they just pick the least worst and hope for the best, really. But I do think young people, they care about the issues. Because they're not voting doesn't mean they don't care about housing or health. They all have opinions on all these subjects. And I think for young people, I do think they've been let down by some of the politicians. I don't think they've been very well represented.
So maybe they're not unlike young people, in lots
Yeah,
of other places as well.
Basically, yeah.
But what's happened here on this side of the border is that young people have got very engaged on issues. So here we saw it on the same-sex marriage referendum, the repeal, the abortion referendum. Are those the opportunities either young people are looking for or would take if they had the opportunity to get involved in those kind of debates?
Oh, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
People are so passionate about those two issues, particularly LGBT issues and the abortion issue. People are very passionate about that. Obviously, I'm pro-choice. A lot of my friends are pro-choice. That's something they care about very deeply.
So it's not politics; it's party politics maybe that turns them off.
Yeah, I suppose that's probably a better way to put it. Yeah, no, they are interested in it, and certainly I think the growth of Alliance, I think over the years has interested people now. I think people are starting to think there's this attitude in Northern Ireland that nothing's ever going to change, and there has been a bit of a change over the past couple of years. But I definitely think issues is what grabs people. I think that's...
So if you were offering advice now to Darragh, Bryan and his colleagues around the cabinet table about this initiative, how can we hear? We'll talk about some of the other underrepresented voices as well as they're characterised. For young people, how would you be saying they can actually encourage them to get engaged?
I'd show them that you care, show them that you're listening. Listen to their voices and what they're angry about, on housing, particularly down here. Obviously, huge issue. Something needs to be done about it. It needs to be done in Northern Ireland as well. And I think if you show that you're listening to young people and you care about them, they'll come your way.
Are they less likely to be orange or green, or identify as orange or green?
A mixture of both. Some people are unionists, some are nationalists, some Republicans, some loyalists, some are neither. But they do have a constitutional preference, and some genuinely don't know. It's very, very nuanced.
Alison, I remember at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, which I covered as a reporter, the Women's Coalition was front and centre in those negotiations. Monica McWilliams and that fantastic, political brains brought to finding a political solution to the problems that faced Northern Ireland at that time. What's happened to the woman's voice in Northern Ireland politics?
I love speaking to Monica about that time. I was actually on a panel with her a few weeks ago, and she still does a lot of work in the women's sector in terms of domestic abuse and the impact our conflict has on that. She uses this great phrase where she says we live in an armed patriarchy, which is just like sums up, Northern Ireland, the problems are. This is where you will enthuse me, when we speak about women and young people. Prior to COVID, I would have spent a lot of time in schools and in youth clubs, and especially in those very working class areas, speaking to young people, because that's who I am. I'm from a very working class community. I was a teenage mother. I came from one of those places where, my mother was a cleaner, and that was the way I was brought up, and I managed to become a journalist, and that, it took a village, it took a lot of people to be able to help me to get like that. And I think that, we owe it to those other young people who are living the way I would have lived when I was a teenager, to make sure that they're given a helping hand so that they can be the best people that they can be. The problem that we have found, and I think in specific in Northern Ireland, in terms of a lot of that European funding and a lot of also the American funding that come through philanthropies and all of that, was that we have gatekeepers to our communities, and those gatekeepers are men, and they are men who were, majority of them were formerly paramilitaries, and they have dominated that community sector and also dominated that funding sector, and that took the money that could have improved the lives of women and children away from them. And even now, when I'm trying to go in and speak to women, specifically sometimes women from the loyalist community, you have to bypass those gatekeepers to get to speak to them, and you'll find that while people have this view that, loyalist women vote for the DUP, so they're anti-abortion, anti-same-sex marriage, and they're not. This is a community full of women who are feminists and who believe in all of the same, the same things in terms of social issues, but they're just staunchly pro-union, and that is, a perfectly legitimate position to hold. I think in terms of and I have had this conversation with people who are in charge of the Sure Island, what they need to do is they need to stop going through those NIO structures where if you want to go into this community and do a project, you have to go through this community group, which is run by this man who is, a previous paramilitary. You need to walk straight around them and say, no, sorry, no, thank you, I don't need your help, and go straight to those women. The reason why they're trying to stop you doing that is because empowered women are very difficult to control, and they don't want them empowered because they want to control all the money, all the funding, they want to control that area. And if you raise those women up, you will find, that you raise a woman up and you will make sure that her children are raised up too, because she will make sure that they are then empowered. And that is where I think that this project could really get in there and really make a difference. But you really do need to stand up to those people who have controlled that sector for so long and say, no, you don't control this area. We will run this project without your assistance or help, and we will use these people, we'll use these women. I mean, in terms of, educational underachievement and employment, I reported on the Social Investment Fund, which was one of the most ridiculous carve-ups of money ever. It had an audit report that slated it. There was a £1.3 million project to bring employment to young men in East Belfast, and they give it to a UDA paramilitary linked group to facilitate, to organise it. I don't know if I went back now and assessed how many jobs came from that, but I'm sure not too many. Instead of, investing that money we could have made, when I think of the billions in funding and community money that's been through Northern Ireland since the peace process, and so much of that was squandered. Now, I know some of it did some really good work, but so much of that was squandered, and there's a real opportunity now, because those young people do not think the same way. Social media, online dating, I mean, they do not live in their wee structures the way we do. They don't live in their wee communities. They don't live in their little enclaves and only socialise with each other. They're out there in the big bad world socialising with each other, and those old, orange and green issues don't matter to them. They basically just want to have a bit of crack, really, don't they? I mean, that's all anyone wanted when they were like 16 or 17.
Sorcha, what about new communities in Northern Ireland? I mean, are there thriving communities that have come in recent years, settled, made their home in Northern Ireland, now have a stake in Northern Ireland? Do they have a voice?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of the Afghanistan conflict and what we've seen, those heartbreaking images that have been so distressing for everybody in the last few weeks. Prior to that, the area that I represent, Lagan Valley, had housed one of the highest, if not the highest, amount of people who had actually been resettled from Syria, which was absolutely fantastic. And my aunt does a little stitch and bitch group down at the church hall, and they use that with the Syrian ladies that come in. Right. They're there on a Thursday evening, and they would come in and they would hear a bit about their life, and they would hear a bit about their other life, and it would be really interesting just to have that kind of magnified out. We have seen that replicated across a number of communities in Northern Ireland, and I think the temptation is always to cast Northern Ireland as this place where you're literally nationalist or unionist, and that's just it, and there's nothing else in between, when the reality is a lot more complicated than that. And I mean, as Sarah has said, LGBT community, it's really only through the sheer tenacity of those grassroots groups and campaigns. Same in terms of women's rights. Alison spoke about, domestic violence and those issues. I experienced domestic violence. I grew up in that. And that was actually the issue, one of the issues that pulled me into politics, because I wanted to try and make it better for people who were in that position and show that it isn't always the defining issue, as people would have seen it in the past about the constitutional issue. But if you have a passion for your community, if you have a passion for social justice, if you have a passion for people, get involved and put yourself out there. And I think the campaigns that you've talked about, repeal, equal marriage, all of those issues, that has been driven largely, shamefully, I'm saying that as an elected rep, shamefully, by people who have campaigned from the grassroots up.
Rather than politicians.
And that's for us to reflect on. Certainly we've been very much in support of those issues for a long time, but the issue is, the job of us is to listen to people and then go and do what they want.
I just want to give a moment or two to the issue of dealing with the legacy of the past, because I think it's a reasonable point to make that you don't really move forward until you've, to some extent, dealt with what's gone before. Maybe, Bob, I can bring you in on this, because we have this British government proposal now for an amnesty, an across-the-board amnesty for those who were accused of Troubles-related crimes. How has that been viewed in the US?
Well, I think amongst the community that follows Northern Ireland and Irish affairs, there's quite a lot of concern about that. And this, I mean, the past troubles, violence, the Pat Finucane case, for instance, as well, would all be issues and topics that Irish America would follow very closely. So this particular issue on the amnesty is one that I think has really excited people, not in a positive way, but really given them some energy to engage. I think they're really eager to hear more from the Secretary for State for Northern Ireland about what this might mean and how the past might be dealt with. I think that, there's a growing awareness that the past is more complicated than, it has sometimes been portrayed in the United States. I think there's an eagerness to learn about, those complexities, to learn about, different views of the past and the political positions of different communities. But the immediate proposal from the Secretary for State for Northern Ireland has, really pushed people to hear more. I think, this summer it has been relatively quiet on some of these issues here in the United States. I do think people are expecting that the fall and the appointment of the new special envoy will bring, from Northern Ireland to the United States, will bring, kind of increased information and awareness about this. In terms of the political leadership, I think a lot of the political leaders are also very aware of particular instances and cases that they would like, addressed, and these have been matters that have deep resonance with American political leadership, because it's been part of the conversation, for so long. It was John Hume who brought the civil rights aspect of what was happening in Northern Ireland to American politicians, and the past and troubles and violence would be considered as part of that here. So I think it will be an issue that people will want to know, how does this resolve? And I think that the current proposal is probably one that most, in the community here, and that many of the, Irish or the political leaders in the United States who follow these issues, might find troubling. That said, the political leadership may not extend themselves, on this matter, right, because the United States, itself has issues around the protection of its military in violent conflicts.
So it would resonate perhaps on that basis. And just, sure. Minister, I don't want to dwell too long on it, but just, the government may well be opposed to what's proposed by the British in this regard, but are you effectively powerless if they decide to go in this direction? Is there anything you can do?
No, I don't think so. I think that goes back to relationships and between the respect between the two governments, and indeed including the executive. We would have and we do have a problem with this proposal. There's no question about it, and that's something that will be dealt with outside of my brief through the Minister for Foreign Affairs and directly between the Taoiseach and the Prime Minister. But there's always difficulties post-conflict, and there have been, and even since Good Friday, that we see that how people have been able to try to address some of the horrendous atrocities of the past and to get to the truth. And that endures even for people going way back to the late 60s, early 70s, both north and south. I've met relatives of families who've been, had desperate atrocities vested upon them, both north and south. We look at the Dublin Monaghan bombings, we look at Belmullis, we look at right the way through, we can look at, both sides.
Political opinion across, I think it's fair to say, right across the north is united in opposing what's proposed. I'm just wondering, what can the Irish government do to try and deflect the British from moving in this way?
I think what we always do, look at a bilateral level and between the Taoiseach and the Prime Minister, there's no question this will be discussed, right. And also between the Minister for Foreign Affairs and his counterpart, the Secretary of State, and that's where diplomacy comes in. And I think and that's something that we believe it would be very damaging.
I want to go to the floor to give the last 10 or 15 minutes or so to questions from the floor, but just while you have the floor, Minister, Alison alluded to it there. This security proposals during the week about hot pursuit.
I was hoping you weren't going to ask me about that.
What would you think?
I realised that hot pursuit is one of my favourite phrases. I hadn't really thought about it until this week.
It sounds great.
I need to write some kind of crime drama and call it Hot Pursuit.
I think Alison earlier on gave an example of that with the response that was there that people would have about An Garda Síochána being in Newry. I think you might have another response that you have the PSNI in Dundalk. So I think what we've been serious though for a second is that both police services work extremely well together on a daily, hourly basis. And I think that if there is further work needs to be done with regard to, when someone is crossing the border and how that happens, I think that's something that can be done. But the issue of hot pursuit now.
The PSNI report said that consultations with senior Gardaí, and I quote, indicate support for developments of this nature.
Now I'm going to say it's all way above my pay grade, and I'm not going there. Okay, but what I'd say to you is that they're being serious though. There are security issues that are there between An Garda Síochána and the PSNI, and we have obviously our own Garda Commissioner now. Drew Harris has obviously experience of both sides of the border, and there's a lot of respect between the police forces. They do work well together. How that is worked out through the Department of Justice is something for the Department of Justice, their counterparts in the north, to deal with. That if there are improvements in that cooperation to deal with organised crime, because there is a lot of organised crime that straddles the border in all different types of areas. So. Okay. That's all I'm saying on it now.
Okay, well, just this once. We'll let you leave it at that. Now, as I say, I'd like to go to the audience. We don't have microphones because we're not allowed to pass them around with COVID regulations. But if you'd like to say something, comment. I'll ask you to keep your comments and questions short because we'll try and get in as many as possible. And if you project as much as you can, I'll endeavour to repeat so our audience online can hear what's been said. So, who'd like to jump in first of all? Just raise your hand. This is a gentleman here.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Just two quick questions. Very interesting.
It always does.
Okay, now I will, because that won't have been caught on the microphone. So your questions are two. First of all, given the divisions within Northern Ireland between communities that Alison identified, the Shankill and the Falls is one example she gave, should the priority be not to see a shared Northern Ireland before we start trying to work on a shared Ireland? And the second, a specific question for the Minister, given that Fianna Fáil's stated aim is the unity of Ireland and its people, are unionists not right to be suspicious of what your motives are? Let's take that one first with you.
And my experience from dealing with counterparts in the unionist community, and certainly right the way through my own party, is that suspicion of Fianna Fáil and our bona fides in this does not exist. I think we've always maintained our constitutional Republican ethos, and that's a republicanism on the basis of equality. So I think our track record with regard to peace on the island and ensuring there's peace and ensuring that there's a shared island and an agreement between its people. So, we ourselves, and not to talk about history all the time, we go right back to Albert Reynolds and the Downing Street Declaration, right to Bertie Ahern and onwards, and our current party leader, who was Minister for Foreign Affairs. I think our actions have clearly shown that what we're about is actually improving the lot for all our people, respecting all traditions, and not forcing any type of political arrangements on any community. And I think the Taoiseach has been really, really strong. We haven't mentioned two words, border poll, today, but the Taoiseach has been very strong when they've been pushed on that as to his opposition to moving prematurely in any way, shape or form on that. And that I believe, really shows very, very clearly Fianna Fáil's bona fides as a government party in this regard.
Okay, of course, political party leaderships change as well, don't they? But you're saying that
they do.
As a party.
As a party, absolutely. No, there's no question, and I think our track record shows that.
Okay, Sorcha, can I bring you in on the second question there, which is about a shared Northern Ireland before we start talking about a shared island? Is the question about a point?
Yeah, well, you know what? I mean, that really makes a lot of sense to me, and certainly in terms of alliance, that's what we prioritise first. Whenever you have a situation where only 7% of our children are schooled together, that's an issue. And that's an issue that isn't going to be changed overnight. Whenever you look at housing, one of the big issues I deal with is housing, in terms of people who can't get a house or whatever, they need to move. And they're looking and they're going, oh, but I couldn't live there. And it's at the stage now where I think people from home are literally looking at a situation, and sometimes they can almost be blind to it themselves, because people don't necessarily all live in segregated communities. That's not the case, but there is definitely the case where that happens. But what's more pernicious and troubling for me is that people will self-select. They may live in an area where we would refer to as mixed, which I absolutely hate. I mean, that in itself is even wrong. I hate that. It shouldn't be the case that we talk like that, but that's the reality. But in terms of that self-selecting where they'll only go here because they feel safe there, or they don't particularly want to go there, to me that's an issue, and that's where a lot of the conversation should be. And I suppose in terms of what that means for us is that you use the words border poll. I'm not scared of that. You know, that let's have the conversation. We're engaging in conversations right across the board. But for me, no matter where the line on that map is drawn, people will still have a line in their head. And there used to be this line about East Germany that even whenever Germany was unified again, people used to take their old route home. For example, where the Berlin Wall would have been, and that you're talking like 10, 20 years after it had fallen. So for me, we need to dismantle the walls in the mind and the walls on the street.
And Sorcha, if you had the power, denominational education, segregated education, whatever you want to call it, would be gone, would it?
Well, we have put forward a private members bill at the minute in the Assembly that is basically working on the premise that any new school being built or considered should be being put forward on the basis that it's integrated, unless there's a specific need. But certainly, yes, absolutely, schools can transform. The first Catholic school in Northern Ireland just recently transformed to integrated the other day. So for me, that's a huge thing.
Okay.
It's about transforming in the here and now too.
Let me go back to the audience. Who else would like to come in? Yeah. Yes, there's a gentleman here. Yes.
Going back to this, where the amnesty, I think that we might be looking at the amnesty and the reasons for the amnesty for the wrong reasons. I think politicians and the political class have a fear of being associated with any of the violence or having any smell of what happened. You know, back in the 70s, when the Irish politicians ran away from problems we had down here, then go to bloody Sunday, come forward to the bloody Sunday. I think if politics of England don't want to have, they're afraid that get the vote, it's partly attributed to the people in the army. But there's a section of politics that want to make sure that it doesn't get any bit above that. Our politicians can blame the IRA and they're absolutely right to do so. But if any mistake made in the political class, or the Ireland to do with the bombing in Dublin, they haven't been totally honest, and the English government has never been totally honest about what happened in
Okay. Okay, it's not a question, it's a comment, and I'll leave it as a comment and go. There was another hand up as well, I think I saw here down towards the front. Yes?
Just to ask, I suppose I'm like Darragh, I have to confess, being a senator, I've a political interest, but one of just something that I've observed from travelling up and down to the north a lot over the last 30 years is that there's a lot less dialogue between what we'll refer to as the two communities. And equally in terms of a lot less north-south exchange, and I'm particularly concerned also in a post-Brexit context that there isn't as much engagement east-west.
Okay, well, let me, before I come to you on that, Sarah, just the questioner, or the audience member, says that he senses a lot less dialogue between the two communities in Northern Ireland, less north-south contacts and dialogue in recent times, and indeed east-west dialogue, which he says is something that particularly was promoted at Boston College, among other interests in the United States, and makes the point that really, rather than we need to focus on investing in infrastructure north-south, but actually investing in people is the point he makes is even more important. And a question for Sarah: if the Scottish are to vote for independence the next time round, where does that leave Northern Ireland? What do you say to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Obviously, there's a big connection between Northern Ireland and Scotland. Obviously, my second name is Scottish. My family are Ulster Scots. I think there'd be a lot of sadness if Scotland goes. I think a lot of people would be very depressed about that if it happened. I don't think it would make anybody vote for United Ireland. I don't think it would change people that way. I do think it will make some people, it will add to the general air of malaise and sadness, and I think, I don't think the Unionist Scottish community is in a good place at the moment, just with everything that's been going on. I think it will just add to that. I do think there will be some people who, if Scotland goes, will think, well, Northern Ireland's going to go next. I don't think that is necessarily true. I think it's very, very complicated, but I do think it will make some people think that it's more likely.
Yeah. Perhaps just by way of a final comment, because I see my time, I've overrun a little bit, so I don't want to go on too much into the red, as it were. But just maybe a final comment, if I can, from each of you on the panel, and back to the shared island, which is where we started. There's so many areas where you can see potential for cooperation on tackling climate change, in health, so clearly illustrated just in relation to what we've been through with the pandemic, closer cooperation on economic development, trade, transport infrastructure, we've talked about that as well, in so many areas. For each of you, a simple question: where do you think the biggest opportunity for closer cooperation lies? Or if you prefer, where the most pressing need might be? Okay, maybe. Do you want to start off with that, Alison?
Well, I think this is the centenary of Northern Ireland. It exists 100 years this year, and I think that all the issues that we have spoke about in terms of all that conflict and trouble and the division that still exists shows that it has failed. As a state, it has failed. It was created a certain way with a certain imbalance, and over the 100 years that has changed to the point where we're now at a sort of crossroads. And I do think that when Scotland leave, and I do think they will leave after the next independence referendum, the Union will slowly start to break up, and that is more to do with this Prime Minister than anything else, because he is a little Englander and he doesn't particularly care about the Union. He cares about his own self-interest. In terms of that, then we're looking at where then can this shared island build on those relationships, and also alleviate the fears of people who think that if we twist it round and we turn around what happened when the island was partitioned, that will we just see a repeat? We'll see when the majority will then become against what will be then a unionist minority. And if we're going to speak about, a border poll, which will happen, I'm sure, in the next, 5 to 10 years, the fears of those people have to be allayed. You have to say, this won't be a poacher come gamekeeper situation. You will not be an enemy in your own country. You will be made to feel welcome.
So
there will be a space for you.
It's not really a shopping list then for you. It's actually much more fundamental than that.
So we need to look about how you do take those barriers and you do take those walls away, but we have to accept that we are on a very definite trajectory, and that is where our island is going. It's tiny. It's a tiny little island, and it makes sense to share our resources in terms of health, in terms of policing, in terms of all of those issues.
Would you prioritise any, like right now?
Yeah, I do think prioritising right now should be, first of all, that the current Irish government should be reaching out and telling unionists we are not the enemy, you do not have anything to fear from us, that this is a conversation that is going to include you, but it's going to include your wishes. It's not, bringing you in so that we have some nice obedient unionists sitting on our panel so that we can say, look, we tick that box. Right. Okay. It is actually to include people in the conversation.
So it's about the point about investing in people then and human relations. Okay.
And it's not something you can say you need to do X, Y, and Z. Yeah. It's a proper outreach and an outreach that's done in good faith.
Okay. Sorcha, what would you prioritise?
Well, from what we've picked up from the panel and what we've picked up from the audience is the need for deeper reconciliation and understanding. And you only briefly touched on the legacy point, but everybody on the panel from the north will understand that at the minute is really deeply distressing to so many people. Yeah. And that stems from a lack of reconciliation. I never really feel that in terms of the Good Friday Agreement that we fully realised the reconciliation part of that. The fact that we only have 7% of children in integrated education, I mean, that to me is disgraceful. And that hasn't been for want of trying, that has been oftentimes through people stymieing and blocking. So for me, there needs to be an introspection first. That we are obviously pushing and have been pushing for decades, but then that needs to be replicated on a much broader basis, north, south, east, west. I often say that sometimes whenever we go down to meetings in Dublin, I feel that people don't necessarily have a handle on what's happening, although that's much less. Same whenever we go over to Westminster and maybe have meetings there, I'm looking at them and going, you don't really fully have a handle on this. And that's the situation that we need to change, and that's where we need to improve.
I hope if you go to Boston College, you won't find that. Bob, looking in from the outside, from stateside, talking and thinking about developing links on the island, what would you be saying are the imperatives now at this point?
Well, again, going back to the connections between the people, I think that's particularly important. I think one thing that we're seeing around the world, in the United States as well, is that when you get bogged down discussing ethnic identity issues, nationality, and culture, you end up with a pretty explosive conversation. I think, though, if you're able to build connections between people around very practical issues, going right back to the opening comments of the minister, then you have an opportunity to develop relationships. The areas I think that the United States can most usefully engage in developing practical links are developing the relationships between the political communities and economic communities across the Atlantic. So between the United States, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Great Britain. And, some areas that I think that we can really discuss in greater detail in the future would be around the biopharma, cybersecurity and software development on the economic side, advanced manufacturing, and new materials manufacturing. And on the political conversations, I think going right back to some of the things that the Shared Island Initiative has addressed, these ideas of the interest in addressing new communities. We're all struggling with this. We can learn from one another about how do we ensure an equitable and fair society and allow people to engage. How do we allow women to engage? How do we allow new communities to engage? These are some very practical areas that we can develop if we put people in contact with one another and they just start talking about their experiences and what's worked and what hasn't worked.
Minister, it's a big shopping list. It's got a lot of ambition, but you can't do everything all at once. So where should the focus be in the immediate period?
Well, I think firstly, it's great that we're talking about it, not just that the shared island exists and exists in a tangible form. It was never going to be perfect, and it's going to develop from that upwards. And tangible, I mean, as well, but backed with finance, that as well is important so people can see individual projects, because sometimes seeing is believing, and what that cooperation, we mentioned narrow water, we mentioned other things around Ulster Canal, north-south, the Eastern Economic Corridor between Belfast and Dublin, crucially important, underpins tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs, what we can do there. If you'd asked me a couple of things, what we do, but you did ask for one, but I'm going to give you two, is really, I think, as two countries and both islands need to figure out what the new relationship is in a new Europe. Forget about putting the European Union political structures aside. How do we, as our closest neighbours, actually operate with each other in practical terms? Do we look at it, the Nordic model, which actually our Taoiseach has spoken about before as well? Like, that's the practical stuff. So how do we deal on housing? What's it's obviously something that's a particular interest to me, but across the two islands, we need to figure that out. Right. And then lastly is youth. We've all discussed it here earlier on, that if you're to invest in anything right now, of people who will change it, I see it from my daughter who's 12, has a completely different view of life, totally different than I would have had, and thanks be to God she does, right? But it's actually youth there. And to go back to the point that was made earlier on, is maybe going around the scrum sometimes outside of those defined community groups and without being disrespectful to them in that sense, and really focusing on our youth.
And finally to you, Sarah, accepting the bona fides of what the Minister and others have been saying, but not ignoring the kind of discussion we've had around all of this. you know, what level or in what areas would you like to see cooperation that actually would make a difference to your life and the lives of the people you know?
There's so many, you know, I mean, health's a big one at the moment, and I know that the health services cooperate in North and South, and I think that the NHS is relying on the health service in the South for some areas, you know, so I think that's a huge thing. Obviously, you know, I work in the housing sector, obviously the two systems are very, very different, but, you know, I think housing activists North and South, I think are starting to talk to each other, and I think that needs to be, I think we need to push our governments to be much better, quite frankly, but for me, people is the priority, you know, and go back to what that gentleman said, you know, I think we can do both. We need to talk about a shared Northern Ireland and a shared island. You know, I disagree with Alison. I don't believe that Northern Ireland's a failed state, and I don't think we're on a trajectory, but I think that's what a lot of other people think as well. But I think you have to meet people where they are. You have to deal with the people you've got rather than the people you want. And I think, you know, even though I think, you know, there's been issues at the moment with unionists and the protocol and cooperation, you know, you just have to truck on. And, you know, that was the case with the peace process. Even, you know, there were stumbling blocks along the way. You have to start somewhere, I think. So for me, it's about people and cooperation, I think.
All right, well, I'll leave the last word with you, if that's all right. And on your behalf, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank our fantastic panel this afternoon, the Minister with us, Sarah, Sorcha, Alison, and Bob, who's over on the link from Boston. So you might like to show your appreciation of their participation this afternoon. And thank you for being with us in person and online, and my apologies to organisers and one and all for overrunning a little bit on the time that I was allocated. I hope you'll forgive me, but feel that it was worthwhile. So thank you very much indeed, and have a terrific continuing Kennedy Summer School. Thank you indeed. Thank you.